Most people think the great trade routes of the ancient world ran through Rome, Persia, India, or China. But what if I told you that some of the most important trade routes on Earth ran through Africa and changed the fate of kingdoms, empires, and entire civilizations? Not around Africa, through it, across its deserts, along its rivers, through its ports, across its coastlines. And for centuries, these routes moved gold, salt, ivory, books, faith, power, and people across vast distances. So why does almost nobody talk about them? Why were Africa's trade routes treated like a side note when they helped build some of the richest and most powerful societies in the ancient world? Because once you understand these routes, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Ancient Africa was never isolated. It was connected, strategic, and deeply entangled with world history. This is the story of the forgotten trade routes of ancient Africa, and once you see them, the map of history looks completely different. Let's start with the biggest myth of all, the idea that Africa was somehow cut off from the rest of the ancient world. That image is still everywhere. Africa gets shown as this blank mass on the edge of history, as if major exchange happened somewhere else and Africa was simply watching from the sidelines. But that is not what the evidence shows. Ancient Africa was moving, goods were moving, ideas were moving. Kingdoms were rising because they controlled movement, and in history, whoever controls movement controls power. That is the key to everything, because trade is never just about buying and selling. Trade creates cities, trade creates armies, trade creates wealth, trade creates influence. And in Africa, trade did all of that. Let's begin in the Sahara. Today, when people imagine the Sahara, they see emptiness, endless heat, a barrier, a place that separates North Africa from the rest of the continent. But in the ancient and medieval world, the Sahara was not just a wall. It was also a highway, a brutal one, a dangerous one, but a highway all the same. Caravans crossed it carrying some of the most valuable goods in the world. Gold moved north, salt moved south. Alongside them came textiles, horses, ideas, and religious influence. Just think about that for a second. Men and animals crossing one of the harshest environments on Earth, not once, but again and again, because what lay at the other end was worth it. That tells you how valuable these routes were, and these routes did not operate by accident. They needed knowledge, water sources, protection, local alliances, timing, leadership. This was not random movement through sand. This was organized exchange, and African states understood exactly how to profit from it. That is where powerful West African empires enter the story. Ghana, Mali, Songhai. These empires did not become rich because they stumbled onto treasure. They became rich because they sat near the arteries of trade and learned how to control the flow. Gold from West Africa was one of the great engines of this entire system. And gold was not just decoration. Gold meant political strength, economic leverage, prestige. It could shape kingdoms far beyond Africa itself. Now here is where the story gets even more interesting. The thing moving north was not only gold, it was power. Because once a state can tax trade, protect routes, and control exchange, it can convert geography into empire. That is exactly what happened. The Ghana Empire became wealthy by positioning itself between regions that needed each other. Mali took that model and expanded it. Songhai later turned it into one of the largest imperial systems in African history. And the most famous face of this wealth, of course, is Mansa Musa. But the real story is bigger than one king. Mansa Musa's fame only makes sense because the trade system behind him was already enormous. He did not invent West African wealth. He revealed it to the world, and what made that wealth possible? Routes. Invisible roads across desert and land. Routes linking mines, markets, cities, and rulers. Routes that turned distant places into connected worlds. But the Sahara was only one piece of the story. Because while caravans crossed the desert in the west and north, another network was transforming East Africa. The Indian Ocean trade. And this is where the old stereotype of African isolation completely falls apart. Along the East African coast, a chain of city-states grew wealthy through maritime trade. These were the Swahili cities, connected to a world stretching from Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Let that sink in. African ports trading across the ocean with some of the most important commercial centers on Earth. This was not a closed world. This was an international one. Ships came carrying cloth, ceramics, beads, and luxury goods. They left with ivory, gold, timber, and other valuable products from the African interior. And the coast did not just receive foreign influence passively. It adapted it, blended it, built something distinct. That is one of the most fascinating things about African trade history. It was not merely about goods moving in and out. It was about cultures meeting, mixing, and creating new worlds. The Swahili coast became one of those worlds, urban, commercial, multilingual, outward-looking. Again, this does not fit the simplistic picture many people were taught. It shows an Africa deeply engaged with global systems. And then there is the Nile, one of the greatest natural corridors in history. The Nile was more than a river. It was a lifeline, a road, a political spine. It connected regions, supported agriculture, enabled movement, and helped powerful states rise along its banks. Egypt is the obvious example, but it was not alone. To the south, Nubia and the Kingdom of Kush also benefited from the Nile corridor, linking inner Africa with northeastern trade worlds. That matters because it shows something larger. Africa's trade networks were not separate pieces floating in isolation. They overlapped. The Sahara routes, the Nile corridor, the Red Sea world, and the Indian Ocean system all formed part of a wider pattern. Movement, connection, exchange. This is why ancient African trade routes matter so much. They help explain how African civilizations became powerful in the first place. Why did some kingdoms rise while others faded? Often the answer was simple: who controlled the route? Who controlled the river crossing, the caravan stop, the port, the gate, the path between resource and market? That control could change everything. A city that sat on a route could become wealthy. A ruler who protected merchants could build loyalty. A kingdom that taxed exchange could fund armies, monuments, and administration. Trade was not background noise. Trade was state building. And yet these routes are still barely discussed in mainstream history. Why? Because once you place Africa back into the story of global trade, the old myths stop working. You can no longer pretend Africa was disconnected. You can no longer pretend Africa had no economic systems of its own. You can no longer pretend Africa was waiting for the world to arrive. Africa was already in the world, and in many cases, the world was coming to Africa. Coming for gold, coming for salt, coming for ivory, coming for access, coming for opportunity. That changes everything. Because the story of ancient Africa is not just a story of kingdoms sitting still on a map. It is a story of motion, of caravans disappearing into heat shimmer, of river traffic carrying goods and influence, of ocean winds pushing ships toward African ports, of merchants, scholars, rulers, and pilgrims moving through networks that tied the continent to the wider world. And maybe that is why these trade routes feel so powerful once you finally see them. They expose the lie that Africa was somehow dormant. No, ancient Africa was active, negotiating, producing, connecting, adapting. It was not outside history, it was helping drive history. And the deeper truth is this: these routes did more than move goods, they moved ideas. Religions spread along them, languages spread along them, technologies spread along them. Knowledge spread along them. Trade routes are never just roads for objects. They are roads for transformation. That is why cities like Timbuktu mattered. That is why the Swahili coast mattered. That is why empires rose around strategic corridors and fell when control weakened. Because to rule trade was to rule possibility. So the next time someone talks about ancient trade as if Africa was missing from the map, remember this. The Sahara was crossed. The Nile was navigated, the coast was connected, the ports were busy, the caravans were moving, and Africa was at the center of far more than most people were ever taught. The forgotten trade routes of ancient Africa were not small, local paths lost in the dust. They were the veins of kingdoms, the engines of empires, the hidden roads that carried wealth, power, and memory across a continent. And once you see them, you start to understand something bigger. Ancient Africa did not rise despite connection. It rose because of it. Keep checking on this channel for future videos on ancient African civilization.